Hi, thank you for joining tonight's webinar. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you for joining tonight's webinar. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thank you for joining tonight's webinar. We'll start in just 2 more minutes. Thank you for joining tonight's webinar. We'll get started in 1 minute. Good evening, everyone. I thank you for joining us this evening. I am Jessica Grant. I'm the interim Public Works Downtown Manager, and we will be presenting the Westside and Lower West Active Transportation Plan implementation. This presentation is also being translated in Spanish by my colleague Norma Cervantes, and you can click on the interpretation button if you want to hear the presentation in Spanish. Also participating in tonight's webinar is Derek Bailey, the city's traffic engineer, and Chelsea Swanson, who is the interim supervising transportation planner, who will be moderating for us. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to use the question and answer icon and type your question. We will answer them at the end of the presentation. You can also raise your hand at the end of the presentation and we will go ahead and unmute you during that time. So with that, let's get started with the workshop. So the purpose of tonight's webinar is to provide background on the council adopted Westside and Lower West Active Transportation Management Plan that was adopted by council in 2020. I believe council member Oscar Gutierrez is also participating or listening in on the webinar tonight. So thank you, council member Gutierrez. We will also be talking about the active transportation program and how that relates to potential funding for infrastructure improvements in the West Side. We'll also be reviewing conceptual plans. Our traffic engineer, Derek Bailey, will bring us through those plans and what the project cost is for these infrastructure improvements or enhancements, and about grant leveraging and next steps and how to stay involved. Before I begin on the background, I did want to have one poll just to see how many that are on the call tonight have participated in prior workshops in 2019 and 2020 related to the Neighborhood Transportation Management Plan. I'm going ahead and start the poll. Great. It looks like about 65% of you have participated in the past, and thank you for coming tonight. And for those that are new to the planning effort, we will go into the next few slides of a little background on how the planning effort came to be. So the purpose of the planning effort was to increase Westside neighborhood livability by addressing pedestrian, bicycle, and traffic safety issues and implementing the Vision Zero strategy. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Vision Zero strategy, it is a council adopted strategy that aims to eliminate all severe injuries and fatalities in city roadways. The planning effort took about a year. We initially held a listening workshop back in April of 2019 to hear residents' concerns on feedback on whether they drive, walk, or bike in the West Side and Lower West Side neighborhoods. We also put out a survey as well to obtain additional feedback. And both between the survey and workshops were very well attended. We also, paralleling the resident feedback, we performed a collision analysis as well in the neighborhood. And basically, between all of those pieces, we came up with approaches to how to address residents' concerns. And then we had a follow-up workshop with the residents to determine and help weight some of the potential items on how we could address those concerns, and laid out basically what could we do now, what were some short-term improvements or construction happening soon in the Westside neighborhoods, and what would be coming down the line. And so all of that was summarized in the Westside and Lower West Neighborhood Transportation Management Plan. And that was adopted by City Council in March of 2020. Again, just diving into, if you were to look at a plan on our website, it is posted there. It has the Vision Zero focus, explaining of what patterns we were seeing for collisions in the neighborhood. It documents all the what we've heard to date from the community, what the emerging themes are that I'll go into in just a minute. And then plan implementation. As I mentioned, there was already some projects that were already funded and happening, already started construction in some areas. Like, for example, under construction now is intersection improvements at San Andreas and Carrillo. And then there were some minor operational items that we just did during 2020. And then there was a list of infrastructure improvements that we did not have funding for. And that's really the purpose of tonight, is to address how are we tackling those unfunded project needs. So what we heard during the outreach effort was basically three major themes. Residents wanted safer and more inviting walking, more neighborhood lighting, and safer biking to school and work. And with those, just as the umbrella themes and the areas that we'll go into more detail this evening as we go through the concept plans, was basically coming up with a project scope that, again, would address neighborhood concerns about traffic safety, improve safe routes to school, complete neighborhood priority missing sidewalks, and improve lighting on San Andreas and Modoc. And this is just a basic graphic of the major areas for those unfunded infrastructure needs. And so the circles represent crossing improvements, where there would be enhanced crossings at locations. So this line here is San Andreas, the other line here is Modoc. The yellow lines mean enhanced lighting along those corridors. And then the blue pieces that you see here and here are areas that we receive the most feedback in terms of needing for to infill sidewalk. So given the project scope, we did apply for the active transportation program. all of those improvements together was approximately $13 million. And that's something that we can normally not fund in the city's streets transportation budget. And so we look to grant sources to help assist with funding community needs, infrastructure needs. So a little bit about the active transportation program. If you are unfamiliar with this grant source, the purpose of the grant is really to encourage and increase use of active transportation modes. So biking and walking. Every 2 years, the state approximately releases $450 million statewide to seek grant funding. We have been very successful in the past for this grant source, totaling over 40 million in infrastructure improvements. The biggest one just adjacent to the Westside neighborhood that you've seen construction over the past year is the Los Positos Modoc Road multi-use path. And every year what we've noticed is this grant gets more and more competitive. So we did apply for the grant in 2020. We came up 2 points shy from the cutoff, and we'll discuss more on how we can have a stronger application in tonight's presentation. So again, these were the applications that we had applied for in the year 2020. That was the cycle 5 round of applications. And we were successful on one project on Upper De La Vina Street, and just missing the cutoff for both Cliff Drive for some enhanced crossings along Cliff Drive, as well as a multi-use path along there. So we think we could have a very strong application moving forward. Applications are due in June of this year. So what features do we need to have in order to be competitive in this grant source? Would be to have features that improve safety, significantly increase walking and biking, such as bike routes and in sidewalk infill as well. Before I go into any more details about how we're striving to make a stronger application in cycle 6, I want to pass it over to Derek Bailey, our traffic engineer, that will go through the details of what we would plan to submit for the next application in cycle 6.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, we're going to break things into kind of 3 broad categories. We're going to talk about crosswalks and areas that we're going to plan to include safer crosswalks in the grant application. We're going to talk about bike routes through the neighborhood that'll be in the grant application, and then sidewalk infill projects that'll be in the grant application. Next slide, please. So just some of the examples of the features that we've used around the city that have been really successful and improving safety and making it more comfortable for pedestrians at intersections. On the left-hand side is curb extensions. And curb extensions is where the curb right at the corner kind of bumps out into the road. That works really well in neighborhoods like the Westside, where there's a high demand for parking. That means that drivers approaching the intersection have a lot easier time seeing pedestrians around that last parked car. And then on the right-hand side is called a pedestrian refuge island. And that breaks the crossing up into 2 for pedestrians, and as well provides a little bit of speed control near intersections as well. The islands tend to be a lot more cost effective than the curb extensions. The curb extensions can be expensive depending on the location. Next slide, please. This is the intersection of San Andreas and Annapolis Street. So this is one of the intersections that's in the grant application. Next slide, please. And if we can get this project funded, this is what we're planning to build at the intersection. There'll be curb extensions, better lighting, and as well rapid flashing beacons. So those are the rapid flashing beacons that you activate with a push button, and that also lets drivers know that there's pedestrian present. Next slide, please. So this is a map of San Andreas Street, and everywhere there's a star is where there's planned to be pedestrian safety improvements, curb extensions, lighting, rapid flashing beacons. And as well, you can see there's kind of a yellow line that goes along the street. That just means there's going to be improved corridor lighting all the way from Cannon Perdido to Mission. One of the issues with the lighting right now is most of the lighting is mounted on wooden Edison poles. And with those Edison poles, the lights have to be mounted at a certain level just to stay away from all the other utility lines. And the problem with that, though, is with the tree canopy, that the height that the Edison mounts the street lights at can create a lot of shadows with the tree canopy. So if the new street lighting corridor is installed, it can be on city poles, and we can mount those a little bit lower so that it's below that tree canopy, and it'll really do a nice job lighting the sidewalk and street. Next slide, please. And another location that there'll be, in addition to San Andreas Street, Chino Street in Arriaga, which is just 1 block away from Harding Elementary. And that will have refuge islands. So we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so not as busy an intersection. So this would be a more cost-effective treatment for that intersection. Next slide, please. And then along Modoc Road, there's 2 school crosswalks on Modoc Road, one at Pilgrim Terrace, one at Portezuelo. And both of those will get rapid flashing beacons. And in addition, we heard last time that we met with the community prior to the last grant application that better lighting along Modoc Road was important as well. So corridor lighting is part of the grant application too along Modoc Road. Next slide, please. That's just an image of a rapid flashing beacon that we have elsewhere in the city. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's crosswalks. Now let's talk about bike routes through the west side. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of an overview of the bike routes that either exist today or soon will exist. You can see the new bike path that's under construction along Las Positas and Modoc on the left-hand side of your screen, as well as the planned bike boulevard, Community Paseo along Gillespie Street. Yeah, there it is. So those will be in place soon. By the end of the year, everything on this map will be done. But you can see even after those are done, there's going to be some gaps between the ends of the bike lanes. So everything in the neighborhood is kind of disconnected. You can see the most significant gap is between the west side and the lower west in the bottom right-hand side of your screen right there. Yeah, thanks. If you can go to the next slide. So everything shown in red will be in the grant application, and that will fill in all those gaps so that everything through the neighborhood will be connected. So let's start by looking at Modoc Road. Next slide, please. So because Modoc Road goes right beside La Cumbre Junior High, we think it'd be a really good idea to have an ultra-safe, protected bike path on Modoc Road. It will look something like on the left-hand side of the screen, except instead of the vertical delineators, there'd be a little raised curb there that would provide a little bit more protection. That would provide just an ultra-safe way for students to get to La Cumbre Junior High. Next slide, please. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, that just shows an image of what the street is like today on top, where the bikes ride on either side of the road. And in order to accomplish that, there's no parking between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. And we know that's an inconvenience for the neighborhood, especially getting more towards Las Positas. That parking's in really high demand over there. On the bottom is what would be built. So there'd be a bike path on one side of the road. And instead of drivers having to move their vehicles between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m., there would be all-day parking allowed on the south side of the road. Next slide, please. And this just shows an image of Portezuelo. This is just right in front of the junior high. So the sidewalk would be widened to about 10 feet wide. And that would provide enough room for students to get right to the front door of the school. Next slide, please. And this is just the other end of Portezuelo as it intersects with Gillespie. And that's how the widened sidewalk on Portezuelo would connect to the Gillespie Bike Boulevard. And as well, the school crosswalk there would also be improved. Next slide. Okay, so now let's shift to the other end of the neighborhood and just talk about the west side to the lower west route. Just the way the streets are laid out in Santa Barbara, if you want to go between the west side neighborhood, which is north of Carrillo Street, to the lower west neighborhood, which is south of Carrillo Street, everybody gets funneled through that intersection at Carrillo and San Andreas. There's no way to avoid it. So that means that our bike route also has to go through that intersection, which does make it challenging because it's a busy intersection. Next slide. So this is the route that will go from the west side to the lower west. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, it would go from Victoria. That would connect into the bottom of Gillespie Street where the new bike boulevard will be. That'll then go down Mercedes. And once it gets to Carrillo Street, then there will be a really short, half a block long multi-use path. So cyclists could safely ride out of the way of traffic on Carrillo Street. Through the intersection of Carrillo and San Andreas, and then down San Andreas Street to Canon Perdido, and then over to Wentworth, which is a nice quiet street. The area right in the immediate vicinity of Carrillo and San Andreas is the most challenging and the most technical. So we're just going to take a closer look at that. Next slide. So we're just going to start on the Carrillo side of the intersection. So this just shows that new multi-use path between Mercedes and Carrillo. That would be built by widening that sidewalk area. We'd actually move the curb out and eliminate the on-street bike lane. So there's enough room for this little path. And that would get you over to the Carrillo-San Andreas intersection. See the green skips would lead you into a bike lane on San Andreas Street south of Carrillo. Next slide, please. And that's just a photo of Carrillo Street, and that little red line there just kind of shows you where the sidewalk will be widened. Next slide, please. And now to San Andreas Street, south of Carrillo. Next slide. We didn't have any options for widening sidewalk in order to create a multi-use path on this side of Carrillo Street in the lower west neighborhood. So this is the one block where we are proposing parking removal on one side of the street in order to put in on-street bike lanes. That side of the street that we're looking at with the red curb, that has less parking than the other side, so it would be less impactful to the neighborhood to put the bike lane on that side. Next slide. And then finally, just where new sidewalks are included in the grant application. Next slide. One location is on West Valerio. There is pieces of sidewalk on West Valerio going up the hill to Elings Park, but there's also a lot of gaps in those sidewalks. So this project would complete all the missing curb ramps and the missing sidewalk gaps. And if we go forward one slide, that's just an example of some of the conditions on West Valerio. So there's sidewalk in front of a few homes and then it's missing like this. And so this would just formalize it and create a continuous sidewalk up the hill to Elings Park, which we know is a popular walking route along a busy street. Next slide, please. Another area that's rather challenging to walk is this part of the neighborhood where Manitou turns into Pedregosa Street, right where the red line is highlighted through that little curved section of the road. There's currently no sidewalk. If we go to the next slide. See, it's a narrow street. It's got turns in it, so the sight lines aren't very good. And as a pedestrian, you really have to scamper through there quite quickly. So this project would put in sidewalk on the right-hand side of the image there. That's the south side of the road. It'll be an expensive sidewalk. There's a bit of a drop off right there, so we'll require some retaining walls, which are can be expensive, but from a safety perspective, this is a good improvement for the neighborhood. Next slide. And then also over towards Mitchell Traina Street, you can just see circled in the middle of the map right there. There's also some missing sidewalks on Euclid, which is just on the other side of the freeway, but that provides a walking route to the Westside Community Center. This will also include a little connection from Euclid up to Mitchell Traina Street, right beside the bridge. We'll put a little sidewalk in there just so you can drop down and easily get to Euclid and light that area really well. So it's nice to walk in at night. And next slide. Good. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica just to talk about our planned grant application. Oh, you're muted, Jessica.
Thank you, Derek, for bringing us through the plans. So for cycle 6, when we had the debriefing with the California Transportation Commission staff on our cycle 5 application, we did get close to perfect scores in the items for the rubrics that we could control. There are a couple of minor items that we can address. What it came down to for which projects received funding and didn't at the last cycle for cycle 5 was leveraging. In the past, the city has leveraged funds on the prior applications for about 1%. And again, that has led to successful grant applications with that 1% match. What we found on cycle 5 that a lot of other communities were matching at much higher rates, and that was a big part of the separation. So how the grant rubrics are done is you get more points for the grant application, the more funding you provide, and it's in intervals of 5%. So for example, for the 1% match, we received 1 point. But if you provided a higher match, say 5%, then it would be 2 points and so forth. And so the max part of that part of the grant application is if you contribute 20% of a match, you can get the maximum of 5 points. So I mentioned earlier on that this particular grant program is extremely competitive. What we have here is the historical scoring for the past 3 cycles of the grant, which essentially had the same scoring rubrics. So as you can see, every year the cutoff score has risen. And that would be important when we're going after the cycle 6 application, is if we could maximize the amount of city leverage. So how do we leverage more funds? Well, it would require a decision from City Council as to what would be an appropriate match. Well, that would be handled in the context of the City Council budget hearings that are coming up, and I believe April or May. There isn't a date certain yet, but while this is, I think, a great scope for the West Side and Lower West neighborhoods, There's also lots of competing priorities for funding in the city of a lot of great other great capital projects and programs. And so if you want to be involved, if this is something that you're interested in, you're more than welcome to attend or speak at a future city council hearing. We can send email updates and post on our webinar when those budget hearings will be. There's also the potential to reach out to engaging state representatives for the cycle 6 funding, if there can be larger than just 450 million for each pot for the 2-year cycles, because it is such a competitive program. There has been talks at the state level of a potential cycle 5 augmentation because there was a surplus of funds in the state. We should know if there is any surplus funding for a cycle 5 augmentation probably by June. And again, because this application scored so high in the cycle 5, we are positioned well. But again, it is still at the mercy of our legislators and state to decide where those funds go, whether it is an augmentation for cycle 5 or if more funds are put into cycle 6. But we do encourage reaching out to state representatives. And as we move forward with the application that's due in mid-June, feel free to reach out to us. We will have our contact information for letters of support and continued community support. Again, this was the planning effort itself would receive unanimous approval of the plan by council in March 2020. This is the community plan, and it always helps for a strong grant application to show continued community support. The best way to contact us is via this email address at Westside ntmp@santabarbaraca.gov. With that, that concludes our presentation. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I do see that there are some questions, and we'll have Ms. Swanson come on to moderate for us. Thanks again for spending your evening with us.
Thanks, Jessica. There are a few questions, and would encourage anyone else who has a question or comment to go ahead and use the Q&A feature. The first one is the crosstown bike path along Mitchell-Torrena to connect to Castillo also part of the 2022 plan? Or is that not a part of this project and waiting on future funding?
That is a great question. That is already funded application for the active transportation program from an earlier cycle. That was a project scope that was put together after we had robust community outreach for the bicycle master plan update. So we anticipate construction to start this summer. We still need to get a contractor on board, but once we have a contractor on board, we will be able to then work out this schedule. And again, we would continue on with community outreach of that, of when to anticipate those infrastructure improvements.
Thanks, Jessica. Next question is, are there any plans for the bridge on Annapolis? I'm assuming that might be the freeway overcrossing, but I'm not positive. The person who asked that question would like to clarify.
For the existing pedestrian bridge, is that?
yeah, I'm not sure based on the question. It's just asked about plans for the bridge on Annapolis.
Okay,
Jessica.
yes, go ahead, Derek.
No, there's currently no plans to make any changes. We know people are uncomfortable with how steep the ramp is on the downtown side of the bridge, and the helix ramp on the west side of the bridge. But fortunately, there is no funding to improve that, and those will be that'll be a really expensive project. So yeah, unfortunately not right now.
Thanks, Derek. I do see a hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute Mary.
Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Oh, okay.
But since we're here, I guess I can ask it this way. So I have several questions, but I'll ask one in the Q&A. The one that I have for now, or two maybe related. First, will there be bike-specific traffic lights at the San Andreas Carrillo intersection? And will the bike lane on San Andreas between Carrillo and Canon Perdido be a two-way lane?
The first question, there will not be bike-specific signals, but the way the sequence of the lights right now at the intersection actually will work really well to bike from south of Carrillo to north of Carrillo, for example. There will be a bike box that's installed, but just with the left turn arrows and everything that are going to be at the intersection, it'll be an easy intersection for cyclists to use. On San Andreas Street, I think the question was, will it be a two-way bike path? No, the bike lanes will be on either side of the street. So it'll look a lot like Rancheria Street, further down in the Lower West neighborhood, where there's parking on one side of the street with a bike lane, and then on the other side of the street, the bike lane is up against the curb.
Mary, did you have another question before?
Sure. I was wondering when the Gillespie project will begin construction, because I think we were originally told a January 2022 start date.
So that project also is scheduled for summer of 2022 now. And that, again, we need to get the contractor on board and know the schedule, and then we will resume community outreach once the schedule is known.
Great, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the Q&A. And there's a question asking if we have any sample support letters, any examples to share.
Yes, thank you for your interest. If you could provide me your contact information, again, via this email address, I will most certainly follow up with you.
Thanks, Jessica.
And it's always good if somebody does want to write a letter of support, is to share your experiences as you're walking or biking in the West Side, and why these improvements may enhance, for example, your family's route to school or your route to work, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Next is a comment. I've seen a lot more pedestrian and bicycle use on Loma Alta since it's been closed to cars. I'm wondering if there may be opportunities there for more active transportation for McKinley School, Santa Barbara City College, and the Lower West Mesa areas. Does Loma Alta have a place in the current bike and traffic plans? If not, could it?
The Currently in the bicycle master plan, Loma Alta is just identified as what we call a class 3 route. So that means that cyclists would just ride in the traffic lane with traffic. On Loma Alta, that works well in the downhill direction because it's easy to keep up with traffic, but not so well in the uphill direction. It's quite hard to maintain any momentum. That being said, we've heard this comment from a number of people about whether or not Loma Alta can stay closed. We've also had comments on the other side too, people quite anxious for it to reopen. We're going to be doing a little bit of traffic analysis this spring while the street is still closed. One of the things we're curious about is how much traffic has diverted through the lower west side, particularly like San Pasqual and Rancheria, because Loma Alta is closed. So I think before we keep that conversation going about whether or not Loma Alta can or should be closed, we just want to gauge the level of traffic that's diverted through the lower west side. That's a trade-off, because the more traffic that uses San Pasqual and Rancheria, the more collisions we would expect to happen. So it is a balancing act.
Thank you, Derek. Up next, very excited about the fixes to the Valerio and Manitou sidewalk gaps. Both would be very helpful. Also intrigued by the use of Mercedes Street to connect to the lower west side and new half-block multi-use path on the north side of Carrillo. I'm a little confused as to how northbound bike traffic coming from the lower west would get across the Carrillo intersection to the new multi-use path. Presently, there's no dedicated left-hand turn lane, so would bicycles still have to move into the traffic lane to turn left across oncoming traffic? This is the most intimidating part of getting through this pinch point. Sorry, that was a lot, so I can repeat any of that.
No, that made perfect sense.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's perhaps we'll go west side to lower west first, just because that's a little bit easier. So come down Mercedes and then cross that new multi-use path over towards Carrillo San Andreas. That little island right there, that's going to have some really wide ramps in it. And then you can take the green skips across the intersection, and that's going to feed right into a new bike lane right there. And then that would continue all the way down to Cannon Perdido. So that's pretty straightforward. Coming the other direction, there will be a bike lane northbound that's going to feed into that green bike box that we call it. So if the cyclists arrive on a red light, they could just move to the front of the line in front of traffic, and they'll have a green left turn arrow that they could just turn right across the intersection and hop on that path. There'll be a little ramp to do so. If they're a little bit further back in the queue, they would just have to single file into the traffic lane, but that light is red most of the time.
Thanks, Derek. Next question. Has any thought been given to changing Loma Alta to just one way, perhaps going down to allow a two-way bike way? Could be designated on that road, as it is dangerous to ride a bike on it. There's no good way to ride a bike from the lower west side to McKinley School. Going up Cliff Drive is super dangerous for pedestrians, and there's no bikeway up Cliff to McKinley or City College. Also, cars speeding on Loma Alta and make it dangerous for bikes and pedestrians.
Yeah, good question. That's one of the things we've been thinking about if Loma Alta does gain any traction, is perhaps a meeting in the middle would be a one-way street. Loma Alta is not a very wide street. It wouldn't be wide enough to go to one way and still have enough room for a two-way bike path. It is quite a narrow street. So at best, we'd be able to get a bike lane in one direction. And that direction would make sense to be uphill, just because bikes do move a lot slower than traffic, and that's generally which direction you should have a bike lane if you can only have one. As far as traffic, We need to talk it over with the fire department and the police a little bit more, but so far we're thinking it would probably make more sense going from City College into the west side just as an evacuation route. But that would require more thought.
Okay, thanks, Derek. On to the next. For the multi-use path on Modoc Road in front of La Cumbre Junior High, will there be a class 2 path? Or there only be a class 2 path on the north side?
No, so the only thing there would be a pathway like this. Some sections of Modoc, there's a little bit more room, so there would, you know, if the higher speed cyclists choose to ride outside of this area, there'd be some wider areas, but in some areas they would have to ride with traffic.
Derek, can you add a little bit for those that hadn't been part of the prior workshops as to why it is on the side of the street opposite the school?
Oh, great point. Yes. Yeah, a few years ago we had some, I think it was the fall of 2019, we had some good public workshops to talk about this facility. One of the things we were kind of struggling with and wrestling with as we were discussing this with the community is which side of Modoc Road is the best side to have this path on. And at first we thought, well, no brainer, it should be on the same side as the school. The challenge with that side, though, is especially as you get a little bit closer to Mission Street and it goes past Kencha and Eucalyptus, those intersections have limited visibility and it's a little bit more challenging to turn out of them. So putting that bike path on that side of Modoc Road, going right past those side streets, presented a safety issue. And so that really pushed the path to the other side of the street. So that's the reason the crosswalks at the junior high are that much more important, because they'll be the connection between the school and the pathway.
Thanks, Derek. Next question, the half block path on Carrillo, will that change the traffic lanes currently there that require cars to merge into one lane?
No, that will stay the same. The reason for that merge is just it goes to one lane as it goes up the hill to the Mesa. So we will have to merge from 2 lanes to 1 lane regardless.
For the bike lane on San Pasqual from Carrillo to Canon Perdido, will anything happen to northbound traffic?
San Andreas from, can you repeat the question?
It says San Pasqual, bike lane on San Pasqual from Carrillo to Canon Perdido, will anything happen to northbound traffic?
I think they probably meant San Andreas, but no, northbound traffic will continue to function as it does today.
There is a bike-friendly street proposed on San Pasqual that is also funded with the improvements along Gillespie and Mitchell, Torina, Castillo, and Sola streets. So that again we'd see construction in 2022. There will be improvements along the San Pasqual corridor.
That's mostly north of Mitchell, Torina, though.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for clarifying, Derek.
Okay, thank you. Next question, along Manitou and Pedregosa, will the sidewalk continue onto Hillside and Clearview?
No, it'll just go as far as the corners with those intersections. That would be a really expensive and really complicated project to connect those sidewalks further down those streets. We looked at that a few years ago, and especially as you get a little bit further down the streets, there'd have to be a lot of tree removal, and just the cost of those sidewalks there didn't seem to be as much safety value as this particular little piece.
Okay, thanks. The next question, for the bike lane on Canon Perdido, San Andreas to Wentworth, will any parking be displaced? Next question, are letters of support from residents effective, or are they better from an organization?
Great question. We do have stakeholder letters of support as well but it is also helpful to also have shared experience from the residents. We do share during our workshops and planning efforts of the various meetings that we have, because that is also part of our public and community engagement. But we also have had the support of many organizations that contributed letters of support for the last application.
Thanks, Jessica. Next question, are there plans to calm the speed of traffic along San Andreas heading towards Carrillo? People often bike on the sidewalk to avoid riding with fast moving cars. Small speed bumps perhaps, so as not to affect fire trucks.
Any speed hump will affect a fire truck. So unfortunately, as far as physical traffic calming devices, no, there's nothing we can do. The curb extensions, the crosswalks, the flashing beacons, they'll all help create an environment that promotes slower speed. But as far as physical devices, no, there's nothing we can do on San Andreas.
Thanks, Eric. Next question. What is the expected route for bicycles going to Santa Barbara City College and the Mesa once they reach the corner of Montecito and Rancheria?
Great question. There is a separate project that's being developed to put in a bike path along Cliff Drive from the intersection of Castillo Street. It'll go all the way out to Hendry's Beach. And that path would be built right against that stone wall, right beside the kind of hold City College up, so to speak, as it goes through the curve. So that Rancheria Street bike lane would connect right into that.
Great, thank you. Next question, can city staff explain why Arriaga isn't considered for an alternative route?
I'm assuming it's an alternative bike route. Yeah, we've been talking to some people about that. One of the requests that we've been hearing is using Arriaga as a route to get from San Pasqual to Harding. And there just isn't a whole lot of demand there for that, because San Andreas Street is the dividing line for the school districts. If you're west of San Andreas Street, you go to Harding. If you're east of San Andreas Street, you actually go to Adams School. So we've done some counts out there, and there just aren't students that are crossing the road right there. So it's just not a high demand route.
Thank you, Derek.
But a really, I'm sorry, Chelsea, if I could just add. As part of this application that we're putting in, though, we are going to be asking for funding to put in curb extensions and flashing beacons right there. That will make it safer for pedestrians and cyclists should they choose to use Arriaga. That combined with the Chino Arriaga intersection changes would make it quite easy to use. It just wouldn't be a formalized route with signs.
Great, thank you. So question, can we turn Loma Alta into a park?
Good question. Yeah, just going back to what we talked about a few minutes ago. Yeah, first we need to quantify the traffic. We're going to be doing a study this spring just to try to figure out how much traffic has diverted into the Lower West neighborhood, because Loma Alta has been closed. And then once we answer that question, then I think we're planning to gauge the interest in making any changes to Loma Alta.
Great, thanks. Next question. Does the work that is underway right now at San Andreas and Carrillo intersection fit in well with this proposal, or would this require a major reworking of the configuration?
No, the changes that are being built right now were designed with this in mind. So, yeah, there won't be any further changes to the intersection other than maybe some pavement markings, but that's quite easy and not nearly as disruptive to the neighborhood.
Next question. Can you further clarify how you are improving your application? Will the focus of the improvement on the application solely be the local match percentage?
That is leveraging is one component of it, and there are a couple other sections that we could improve upon that hopefully could get us maybe a couple more points. Derek, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, the state gave us a few hints. I think we can squeeze one or two more points out of and improve upon our application. But as you mentioned, Jessica, just about every category was perfect last time. So there's not a whole lot of room for improvement other than that leveraging category. That, and as you also mentioned, this program is getting more and more competitive with every cycle. So it's possible that 1 or 2 points wouldn't get us there this time. So we really don't see a way around improved leveraging in order to make this a successful application.
Yes, there was a couple of points where we were deducted, even though it wasn't really part of the scoring rubric, but it had to do with non-infrastructure components for safe routes to school outreach at Harding and La Cumbre Junior High and McKinley Elementary Schools. The city works really closely with SB Bike, the Bicycle Coalition, and Coast as far as for education for schools. And we had in the grant included extra monies. So when the infrastructure improvements were to go in, there would be specific instruction on how to use the new infrastructure from the elementary to junior high level. Is that something that we still would like to have as a component in the grant application? So we will be following the workshops very closely that the state is providing to see how we can strengthen that component.
Thank you both. There's 2 more questions I see. And one is, what is the cost of a light post? And the other is, will bus stops be changed or improved on San Andreas Street?
Sure, I can try to answer those. The post itself is a couple $1,000s, but the expensive part of putting a street light in is getting electricity to a street light post. So the underground conduit and the wiring that has to run from pole to pole, that's the expensive part. So we typically say when you're doing a lighting corridor, it averages out to about $15,000 to $20,000 per light, rule of thumb. And for the bus stops on San Andreas Street, there is one that we're looking at on northbound San Andreas at Sola. That bus stop is what we call a near side bus stop. So as you're approaching an intersection, the bus stops on the near side, the side of the intersection closest to you. The downside with having a near side bus stop is when the bus stops, pedestrians can get out and quickly try to cross the street right in front of the bus. And there are not very good sight lines when that happens. So it's generally preferable to have what we call a far side bus stop. So the bus stops on the opposite side of the intersection from where it's approaching from. So that's something that we're looking at Sola Street right now, is just moving that bus stop to the far side or the north side of the intersection.
Also, with the proposed crossing improvements will enhance access just to the existing bus stops as well, with the added curb extensions to shorten exposure in the roadway at some of the intersections, and then also the rapid flashing beacons. Again, it causes more visibility for pedestrians in the roadway.
Yeah, that's a great point. Most bus riders, they get on one side of the road and then they get dropped off on the opposite side of the road when they come home later in the day. So either when they get on the bus or they get off the bus, it usually involves a street crossing. So one of the things we can do to encourage transit use is just to have better crosswalks near bus stops.
Great, thank you both. I'm not seeing any additional questions or hands raised at this time. So if there's
Great
any-
questions.
Yes, fantastic questions. We'll hang on for just a minute or so if there's any other questions. One thing that I forgot to mention is there is an in-person workshop for these improvements this Saturday at Bonet Park, right adjacent to the playground. So if you have anything more that you want to convey or come up with questions later, feel free to meet us at the park. It's from 10 to noon. And if any of your neighbors you think would be also interested in talking to city staff about these improvements, feel free to advertise the workshop for us so we can meet as many residents as possible. It is nice to have that face-to-face contact, but we are also, our virtual workshops have been very well attended as well. So really, again, appreciate you spending your evening with us. These have been fantastic questions. Thank you. There any more questions?
Yes, actually, there's one more. Are there any plans for adding this speed reading signs?
No, there aren't. We only have a few of them in the city, and we've had mixed results with how well they slow traffic down. The one other negative thing for us is they are maintenance intensive. They break a lot, and we've got a really small electronic maintenance staff, and we can only maintain a limited number of devices. We think we get a lot more bang for our buck, so to speak, with our maintenance staff, with like the rapid flashing beacons, traffic signals, those types of electronic devices, as opposed to the speed signs, which, like I said, have had mixed results.
Thanks, Derek. I'm not seeing any other questions or hands raised at this time.
Okay, well, thank you again for attending tonight's webinar. Really appreciate it. And again, if you want to chat with us on Saturday from 10 to noon at Bonet Park next to the playground equipment, feel free to come join us. And with that, have a wonderful evening. Thank you.